Jasenovac Concentration Camp. When we think of the horrors of World War II, the mind often turns to the infamous concentration camps of Auschwitz, Dachau, and Treblinka. But there was another, lesser-known camp where the brutality was so extreme, even the Nazis themselves were shocked. Welcome to Jasenovac, a name that echoes with unspeakable suffering and death. Operated by the fascist Ustasha regime in the Independent State of Croatia, Jasenovac became a symbol of the darkest depths of human cruelty. The horrors of Jasenovac cannot be fully understood without first exploring the historical context that gave rise to it. The story begins with the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of World War I. As the old imperial orders crumbled, a new nation emerged, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, established in December 1918. This new state, which would later be renamed Yugoslavia in 1929, brought together a diverse mosaic of ethnicities, languages, and religions under a single political entity. The unification of these disparate groups was driven by the desire for self-determination and protection against external threats, particularly from neighboring Italy and Hungary, who had territorial ambitions in the region. Yet the new nation was anything but homogeneous. It was a delicate patchwork encompassing Orthodox Christian Serbs, Catholic Croats, Muslim Bosniaks, Slovenes, Montenegrins, Macedonians, Albanians, Jews, and Romani people. This rich tapestry of cultures was both a strength and a source of tension. The various groups had their own distinct histories, languages, and traditions, shaped by centuries of rule under different empires. The Serbs, for example, had lived under the Ottoman and later the Habsburg empires, developing a strong Orthodox Christian identity. In contrast, the Croats and Slovenes had been part of the predominantly Catholic Austro-Hungarian Empire, fostering a Western European cultural orientation. Muslim Bosniaks, who had converted to Islam during Ottoman rule, often found themselves caught between these two dominant Christian groups. Meanwhile, Jews and Romani people, though smaller in number, contributed to the cultural diversity but were frequently marginalized and targeted for discrimination. The Balkans had long been a contested frontier, a crossroads between East and West where empires clashed and cultures intertwined. The Ottoman Turks ruled over much of the region from the 15th century onwards, leaving a profound impact on the social and cultural fabric. During their rule, many Bosnians converted to Islam, and the Ottomans employed a millet system, granting religious communities a degree of autonomy, but also reinforcing sectarian identities. Simultaneously, the Habsburgs expanded their influence in the northern and western parts of the Balkans, particularly Croatia and Slovenia. Their rule introduced Western European legal, educational, and administrative systems, further distinguishing these regions from their Orthodox and Muslim neighbors. These competing empires often employed divide-and-rule tactics, pitting different ethnic and religious groups against one another to maintain control. Such policies sowed seeds of mistrust and animosity that would persist long after these empires had faded. By the early 20th century, national consciousness was on the rise across Europe, and the Balkans were no exception. In this region, national identity was closely intertwined with religion and language. For Serbs, their Orthodox Christian faith and the use of the Cyrillic alphabet were key markers of their identity. They viewed themselves as the heirs of the medieval Serbian kingdom, with a mission to protect Orthodox Christianity against Catholic and Muslim encroachment. In contrast, Croats identified strongly with their Catholic faith and the Latin script. They saw themselves as part of the Western European cultural sphere, and often looked to Austria and Italy as models. This sense of distinct identity was further reinforced by the Croatian language, which, while mutually intelligible with Serbian, differed significantly in vocabulary, pronunciation, and, most notably, script. Language itself became a battlefield of identity. Even everyday words were loaded with political significance. The Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks, occupied a unique and often precarious position in the landscape. Descendants of Slavs who had converted to Islam during the Ottoman era shared linguistic and cultural similarities with both Serbs and Croats, but were religiously distinct. They were often seen as a relic from the Ottoman past and were marginalized by both the Orthodox Serbs and Catholic Croats. This marginalization left Bosnian Muslims vulnerable, as they became a target for nationalist agendas seeking to purify the region. The Ustasha in particular would later manipulate these divisions, at times attempting to co-opt Bosnian Muslims into their cause, while simultaneously persecuting those who resisted. Beyond ethnic and religious differences, economic and political disparities also fueled tensions. The newly formed Yugoslavia was dominated politically by the Serbs, who held key positions in the government, military, and police. This centralization of power alienated many Croats and Slovenes, who felt that their regions were being economically exploited to benefit the predominantly Serb areas. In the 1920s and 1930s, these grievances led to growing calls for greater autonomy for Croatia and Slovenia. The central government, however, was resistant to such demands, fearing that decentralization would lead to the breakup of the fragile state. This refusal to accommodate regional aspirations only deepened the sense of alienation and resentment among non-Serb populations. As the Great Depression hit Yugoslavia in the 1930s, economic hardship exasperated existing political and ethnic tensions. Extremist ideologies began to take root, offering simple solutions to complex problems. For some Croats, the Ustasha movement, founded by Ante Pavelić in 1929, presented a vision of a pure Croatian state, free from Serb domination. The Ustasha drew inspiration from the rising tide of fascism across Europe, particularly Mussolini's Italy and later Nazi Germany. They adopted the symbols and rhetoric of these movements, blending them with a virulent brand of Croatian nationalism. Their ideology was built on hatred of Serbs, Jews, and Roma, who were seen as obstacles to the creation of a greater Croatia. The Yugoslav government, under King Alexander I, responded to the rise of nationalist and extremist movements by imposing authoritarian measures. In 1929, the king dissolved parliament, banned political parties, and established a royal dictatorship. This move, intended to suppress separatism and maintain unity, instead pushed the opposition underground where it became more radicalized. The Ustasha, now an outlawed organization, operated from exile, carrying out acts of terrorism, including bombings and assassinations. Their most audacious act came in 1934, when they were implicated in the assassination of King Alexander I in Marseille. The murder shocked Europe and revealed the lengths to which the Ustasha were willing to go to achieve their goals. By the eve of World War II, Yugoslavia was a nation on the brink. Political divisions, economic hardship, and ethnic tensions had created a volatile mix. The rise of fascism in Europe, coupled with the ambitions of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, would soon provide the Ustasha with the opportunity they had been waiting for. In April 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia, quickly defeating the disorganized and demoralized Yugoslav forces. The country was dismembered, and the Ustasha, with the backing of the Axis powers, established the Independent State of Croatia, or NDH. This puppet state, under the leadership of Ante Pavelić, would become the setting for some of the most horrific atrocities of the Second World War, as the Ustasha sought to realize their vision of an ethnically pure Croatia. The foundation had been laid. Decades of division, hatred, and extremism created a tinderbox. Now, with the outbreak of war, it was about to explode in a frenzy of violence and genocide, the likes of which the world had rarely seen. In the summer of 1941, mere months after the establishment of NDH, the Ustasha regime set in motion one of the darkest chapters in World War II history. Along the banks of the Sava River, in the heart of Croatian territory, they began constructing the Jasenovac Concentration Camp Complex. By August of that year, the camp had opened its gates, unleashing an unparalleled reign of terror. Jasenovac was not just a concentration camp. It was an extermination camp, designed to eliminate Serbs, Jews, Romani, and political dissidents in the most brutal and inhumane ways imaginable. While Nazi Germany was building its own death camps, often relying on industrialized, systematic methods like gas chambers, Jasenovac was a place where killing was personal, grotesque, and often gratuitous. At Jasenovac, the killing was not impersonal. mechanized or hidden behind the sterile efficiency of gas chambers or mass shootings. Instead, the Ustasha guards reveled in their sadism, taking a hands-on approach to the murder and torture of prisoners. It was a place where cruelty and violence were not only tolerated, but encouraged, where the goal was to not only exterminate, but to dehumanize and break the will of those who suffered. The Jasenovac complex was vast, sprawling over approximately 240 square kilometers, and consisted of several subcamps, each with its own horrific specialization. These subcamps were essentially death factories, but their methods of execution were disturbingly different from the camps operated by the Nazis. The main camp, Jasenovac III, known as the Brickworks due to its former industrial purpose, became the center of the Ustasha's extermination efforts. It was here that the majority of the killings took place, and where thousands met their death in the most gruesome ways imaginable. Stara Gradiška, one of the most notorious subcamps, was specifically used for the internment of women and children. The brutality inflicted there was unimaginable. Thousands of women were subjected to sexual violence, starvation, forced labor, and mass executions. And it was here that the horror of child murder reached its grim peak. What set Jasenovac apart from other concentration camps was not just the sheer scale of death, but the intimate, savage brutality with which it was carried out. Ustasha guards at Jasenovac did not merely execute prisoners, they tortured them in unspeakable ways, turning murder into a macabre form of entertainment. Unlike the mechanized murder of Auschwitz or Treblinka, where victims were often unaware of their fate until the final moments, Jasenovac's prisoners lived in constant fear, knowing that death could come at any moment, and in the most horrifying ways. Guards wielded knives, hammers, axes, and even agricultural tools to kill their victims. The guards took pleasure in inventing new and horrific methods of execution. Some would stage competitions to see who could kill the most prisoners in a single night. They employed everything from knives to scythes, cutting down rows of people with the cold precision of butchers. One infamous guard, Petar Borzika, reportedly killed over 1,000 prisoners in a single night using a specially designed knife known as the Srboziak, literally the Serb cutter. But the sadism didn't end with execution. Many prisoners were tortured for days or even weeks before their deaths. Mutilation was common, with guards taking pleasure in disfiguring their victims before finally killing them. In some cases, prisoners were forced into gladiatorial-style fights where they had to kill each other to survive, all while the Ustasha guards watched, cheering and placing bets. The suffering at Jasenovac was not confined to the moments of execution. Prisoners endured hellish living conditions that made survival a daily struggle. Crowded into wooden barracks, often with hundreds packed into spaces meant for a fraction of that number, they were subjected to extreme hunger, exhaustion, and filth. The camp was built on marshland, and prisoners frequently stood in ankle-deep water mixed with sewage. The filth attracted vermin, and rats and lice were constant companions. Inmates were given little food, often just watery soup or scraps of bread. Disease ran rampant. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis claimed thousands. Medical care was non-existent, and those who fell ill were left to die or beaten to death. Children were often subjected to horrific torture. Many were starved to death, while others were brutally murdered by the guards. In some cases, babies were often separated from their parents and left to die from neglect and starvation. The camp's female guards, notorious for their cruelty, would beat and torture these children, showing no mercy. The Ustasha viewed the murder of children as a necessary part of their genocidal mission, to eliminate entire generations of those they deemed undesirable. The horrors of Jasenovac were epitomized by two men whose names are now synonymous with cruelty: Miroslav Filipovic, a former Catholic priest, and Vjekoslav Luburic, one of the chief architects of the camp's atrocities. Miroslav Filipovic, also known as Brother Satan, was a Franciscan friar before joining the Ustasha. As the commandant of Jasenovac, he personally oversaw the execution of thousands of prisoners, often donning his priestly robes while administering death sentences. Filipovic became the embodiment of moral perversion, a man who had once preached faith and compassion, now reveling in bloodshed. Vyacheslav Luburic, on the other hand, was a true psychopath. He relished the torture and sadism that characterized the camp, known for his hands-on role in devising some of the camp's most brutal methods of killing. Luburic was feared even by his fellow Ustasha for his extreme cruelty. He took personal pleasure in executing prisoners, often prolonging their deaths in the most grotesque ways imaginable. Luburic escaped justice after the war, living in exile in Spain until his assassination in 1969. For decades, he evaded responsibility for his crimes, never answering for the unimaginable suffering he caused. The violence of Jasenovac was so extreme that even the Nazis, notorious for their own genocidal atrocities, expressed discomfort. SS officials, including Heinrich Himmler, were alarmed by the extreme and public brutality of the Ustasha. They feared that such sadism would destabilize the region and make it harder to maintain control over occupied Yugoslavia. Himmler sent envoys to Jasenovac to investigate the camp's operations. There were even discussions within the Nazi hierarchy about shutting down the camp or replacing its leadership due to the excessive brutality. However, despite these concerns, the Ustasha continued their campaign of genocide without interruption. For the prisoners of Jasenovac, this meant that there would be no reprieve. The killing continued unabated until the final days of the war. In early 1945, as Allied and partisan forces closed in on Croatia, the Ustasha attempted to cover up the atrocities they had committed at Jasenovac. Guards began burning documents and destroying parts of the camp in a desperate attempt to erase evidence of the genocide. Some of the buildings, including execution sites and barracks, were demolished, and mass graves were hastily filled and covered. However, the sheer scale of the horror could not be so easily erased. Bodies remained buried in unmarked mass graves, and the memories of survivors and witnesses could not be wiped away. The prisoners who remained in Jasenovac during the final days of the war were subjected to further terror. In April 1945, as the Ustasha leadership prepared to flee, the remaining inmates were faced with the prospect of certain death. Sensing that their captors were preparing to liquidate the camp entirely, around 600 prisoners staged a desperate revolt on April 22, 1945. Armed with makeshift weapons and a fierce will to survive, they attempted to break out of the camp. Most were cut down by Ustasha guards, but around 100 prisoners managed to escape into the surrounding countryside, where some eventually found refuge with advancing partisan forces. By the time the partisans liberated the Jasenovac complex in May 1945, the camp was almost entirely in ruins, and only a few survivors remained to tell the tale. The partisan soldiers, hardened by years of brutal guerrilla warfare, were horrified by the extent of the atrocities they discovered. They found skeletal remains, piles of personal belongings, and evidence of the systematic murder of hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political dissidents. The mass graves and remains of destroyed buildings told the story of one of the most horrific chapters in human history, a story that would haunt Yugoslavia for decades. As the war ended, the Ustasha leadership, including Ante Pavelic, sought to avoid capture and retribution for their crimes. Pavelic fled to Austria in the final days of the war, along with other high-ranking officials. There, they blended in with the thousands of other Axis collaborators, soldiers, and civilians fleeing the advancing Soviet and partisan forces. Pavelic and many of his top aides were able to escape the immediate aftermath of the war through a combination of false documents and assistance from sympathetic networks. These networks included members of the Catholic Church, particularly those in Italy and Spain who facilitated the escape of many war criminals in what became known as the Rat Lines. Pavelic himself found refuge in Italy before eventually making his way to Argentina, where he lived in hiding under the protection of Juan Perón's government. Pavelic later moved to Spain, where he lived out his remaining years under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco. Though there were several attempts to bring him to justice, Pavelic evaded capture and trial. In 1957, He was severely wounded in an assassination attempt in Argentina by a Yugoslav agent, but he survived the attack and fled to Spain. He died in 1959 in Madrid, never having been held accountable for the genocidal crimes he orchestrated. Other Ustasha officials also managed to evade justice, settling in various countries across Europe and North and South America. Some were captured and tried by the Allies or the new Yugoslav government, but many lived out their lives in hiding, their crimes largely unpunished. After the war, Yugoslavia was reconstituted as a communist federation under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, the leader of the partisan resistance movement. Tito's vision for post-war Yugoslavia was centered on unity and reconciliation between the various ethnic and religious groups that had been torn apart by the war. His regime promoted the ideology of brotherhood and unity, a policy that sought to suppress nationalist sentiments and prevent a resurgence of the ethnic hatred that had fueled the atrocities of the war. Under Tito's rule, public discussion of the wartime atrocities, including those committed at Jasenovac, was discouraged. Tito believed that focusing on the past would only inflame old tensions and undermine the fragile peace that had been established in the aftermath of the war. As a result, many of the horrors of Jasenovac were swept under the rug, and survivors were often reluctant to speak about their past experiences. While the policy of enforced silence helped maintain a degree of stability in the post-war years, it also meant that the full extent of the crimes committed by the Ustasha regime was not widely acknowledged. The suffering of the victims, particularly Serbs, Jews, and Roma, was often minimized or ignored. Tito's regime did establish memorials at the site of Jasenovac, and annual commemorations were held, but these were often tightly controlled by the government and framed within the broader narrative of Yugoslav unity. This silence created a dangerous vacuum, one that would later be filled by nationalist revisionism. In the 1990s, as Yugoslavia began to disintegrate, the old wounds that had been suppressed for decades were reopened. Nationalist leaders on all sides invoked the memory of Jasenovac and other wartime atrocities to justify new acts of violence. Serbian nationalists, in particular, used the memory of Jasenovac to fuel anti-Croatian sentiment, portraying themselves as the long-suffering victims of Croatian aggression. Croatian nationalists, in turn, sought to downplay the crimes of the Ustasha and recast the NDH as a legitimate state fighting for Croatian independence. This cycle of historical revisionism and manipulation of memory helped to fuel the brutal wars of the 1990s, particularly the Croatian War of Independence and the Bosnian War. In these conflicts, atrocities were committed once again, and the ethnic hatred that had been buried for so long resurfaced with devastating consequences. The site of Jasenovac has been preserved as a memorial and museum, serving as a reminder of the horrors of genocide and the dangers of ethnic hatred. However, even today, the memory of Jasenovac is contested. Nationalists on both sides continue to use the camp's legacy for political purposes, either to downplay or exaggerate the scale of the atrocities, depending on their agenda. Ultimately, the lesson of Jasenovac is not just a historical one, it is a warning about the dangers of unchecked hatred, the fragility of peace, and the enduring consequences of genocide.